So, my name is Teddy Kimball. I was raised here in Pine Island, went to school kindergarten through 12th grade, and we now live on the south side of town where we have a vegetable farmer, and I live with my wife and 2 young kiddos.
Hi, wife.
This is where we've chosen to make our home. We've invested in our 2 small businesses here and where we've chosen to enroll our kids. And so I say that to you because this is a campaign event for me, but Pine Island is my home. This is my community that I care very deeply about. And so my goal here today is to kind of cut through the big generalities and just convey to you what I've learned about this project, and then also what I would do and what the state can do in the state legislature. So my name is Ted Kimball. I am running for state senate here in our district. It covers Pine Island, Zabrona, Canyon Falls, Red Wing, Wabasha, Lake City, Plainview, Dover, Yoda, Elgin, Millville, and I'm running in the Republican primary on August 11th. And I'm specifically calling myself out, not as a conservative or a liberal, but as an agrarian. And so for me, that means I value rural development, widespread property ownership, family farming, small towns, local food production, and political decentralization. And I'm running basically because I don't feel that my beliefs or my vision for the state is represented very well by either candidate or the traditional party platforms. And so with that, today's topic is going to be pretty much just about the data center. I've got 3 goals today. The first is to give a good faith overview of Project Skyway and why this is something that might be good for our community. The second, I want to do a little bit of a deeper fact-based analysis of some of the agreements that have been signed and try to make the case that it's not really as it seems, and it's going to be more of a specific project tailored specifically for Google. And finally, I'm going to talk about ways that the state already has regulated data center and also what could be done in the future and what I recommend doing. All right, so first off, cities often find themselves, I think, stuck, where they feel on one hand, they need to try to meet or reduce the property taxes of their residents. At the same time, folks are demanding more services and more efficient services. And certainly cities can do a poor job at both of these, but I think in good faith, they're trying to balance these 2 competing needs. And I think they've also been told time and time again here now for a good decade to grow or die. They need to grow their tax base or the remaining residents will be stuck on the hook for increasing costs. So we want growth. We've also decided publicly that we do not do public programs anymore. And by that, I mean we don't want our taxpayer money to go to the city to purchase a piece of land, to build out the infrastructure, to build the roads and the sewer connection systems, to parcel out the lots, and then to offer those for sale to businesses. We don't want to take that risk. We don't think that's something that we as residents have shown the appetite for. And so if you're going to grow, the city needs to look for outside developers who come in, pay for the upfront costs, to bring in property taxpayers, and then the city, with that property tax money, can pay for the ongoing maintenance costs. And so cities are doing their best to make themselves attractive to outside development. They're trying to create investment. So this is where Ryan Companies comes along. Sometime in 2005, they approached the city to develop the land north of town, east side of 52, and to develop it into an industrial park. And indeed, the city's master plan has long called out that this land its long-term future use is for light industrial. And that's not something I've previously heard people complain about. So to get this done, they completed what's called an alternative urban area-wide review. And that's something that the city and the developers need to do to basically they conduct a general survey of all the things that might potentially happen here, all the problems that might potentially happen, and ways that they might be able to mitigate them. They do this when they don't know of a specific project and they don't have specific details, but it allows them to move forward with the planning for the development. So in addition to this, Ryan Companies is willing to build out the public infrastructure to set up this industrial park, which they're estimating at about $6 million out of their costs. And indeed, as part of this deal, one of the big things is the tax abatement. But after the abatement, the city is estimating that we will generate $131 million of new revenue over 28 years. We're talking about doubling the budget of the city. If city leaders wanted to, we could use that money to drastically lower our property tax payments, as well as building out new services. So in addition, the abatement's going to send $3 million to a community fund for 28 years and $23 million to our public school system. And finally, the project is going to support 38 full-time, good-paying jobs in our community, while also creating a huge number of construction jobs and business for the local economy while it's being constructed. So environmentally, the system is going to be a closed-loop water system. So that means what they're doing is they have water in pipes that is circulating its entire way through. Cold water comes in, cools down the servers, gets hot, comes back. Now they're using a massive cooling system to cool that water down. That water is going to be a treated water or something with a water glycol mixture. There are well-established processes for just safely disposing of and treating that water. It's not going to go into our sewer system. Google has continuously shown that they have the money and they need the goodwill, and they've been good on environmental decisions like this typically. And it's also going to be just the law to follow that. Let's see. Noise is going to be regulated by state standards, and the data center cannot exceed the standards put forward by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. The state requires any data center to pay for all of their own energy upgrades, so the infrastructure required to get them going is going to be covered entirely by the data center. And the state is also going to require the data center to build out renewable energy to match their consumption. And that's not on-site renewable energy, that's something that's spread throughout the rest of the state. And so I think if you look at it just like this, and you listen to the narrative that's out there, this project can make a lot of sense for our residents and for our ability to continue to grow without raising our property taxes. However, when you look a little deeper into the facts, I think it becomes, and look past the narrative documents, I think it becomes pretty clear that a different picture emerges. I think that Ryan Companies has been intentionally coy with us and have known all along that there's a single tenant with a single purpose here, even though they misled that from the beginning. And I think they've done this intentionally to avoid having to do an environmental impact statement, which would require revealing a lot of specific details about this project and would have opened it up to much more scrutiny before it was passed. And so you can tell this is for Google by looking into the facts of two documents. First, we have the conditional use permit that was approved on January 20th, and then the tax abatement agreement that was approved on February 4th. So the conditional use permit changes the zoning from agricultural to light industrial, but on top of that, it adds a conditional use permit that allows them to do specific things that the rest of us cannot do in light industrial. Specifically, that allows them to build data centers, build energy generating and energy storage facilities, build electrical infrastructure up to 345 kilovolts, build utility scale solar farms, exemptions from height requirements, and it exempts the city noise standards whenever they're running their generators for backup purposes. The grid is down. And it also prevents the city from later changing the noise standards should the building permit, once the building permit is occupied. And they're only okay with these standards in the first place because these are what are known as A-weighted standards. A-weighted noise standards are meant to measure the impact on your hearing, particularly how much it could hurt your hearing, from moderately loud, moderately close distances. It's intentionally designed to filter out the low-frequency hums that data centers will produce. Okay, second, we have the tax abatement agreement. So I think this also makes it clear this project was always intended for a single purpose, single project for a single purpose, and that's Google. Okay, so it works like this, and bear with me, I'm gonna get some numbers here, and I am gonna throw a spreadsheet of how I got to this up online, both on my website and the Facebook group later, so you can dig into this and see for yourself. But, okay, so let's say we're gonna estimate a $300 million valuation for the data center project. And that number comes from the estimates of a 300,000 square foot facility with a $700 million capital expenditure. But remember, a lot of their capital expenditure is going to be servers, GPUs, and cooling equipment that's not going to be in the property tax budget. So we take that 300 million. The state, for commercial purposes, says multiply that by 2%. That gives us $6 million. This is Google's initial tax capacity added to the city. The current tax capacity of all the residents is 5 million. Google comes in and they add 6 million. But Pine Island charges 83% of the tax capacity, that's what you pay too, and so that 6 million becomes 5 million. So they're on the hook originally for 5 million before the abatement comes in. Now the abatement says you take $500,000, give that to the city. What's left, 85% of that is abated. And that would lead to about $3.8 million. But state statute says that the city can only abate 10% of its tax capacity. Okay, so we had 5 million for residents, Google adds 6 million tax capacity, we've got $11 million. That means that the city is now allowed to abate up to $1.1 million per year total. In the tax abatement agreement, the city has agreed that they will never abate more than 85% of what they're allowed to abate. So they can't even give that full 1.1 to Google, they can only give $935,000 of an abatement to Google. So that basically takes Google's tax bill from 5 million down to 4 million. They get about a 20% tax break. But even after that, we're going from, a 5 million tax capacity, so about $4 million in tax, and to basically doubling that. So we are still doubling it, even after this abatement. Okay, but the important point here is that basically any investment by Google, anything over, I think, $55 million, they take the whole abatement. So this is a Google-specific abatement. The laws, the rule, the agreement, the tax abatement agreement specifically calls out that, hey, we're going to take our abatement, and then we have to apply this 85% max. And if it exceeds that, tenant 1 gets everything, and if there's anything left, tenant 2 gets it, and then tenant 3 gets it, all the way to stage 9, because there's going to be 9 stages in this project, potentially. But any way you run the numbers, the entirety of the tax abatement goes to Google. There will not be an abatement available for any future tenants in that Project Skyway. Second, which I think is crucial, is because we have now locked up 85% of our abatement to Google for 28 years, if we so choose to offer a tax advantage to a local or small business, we're now giving $1 million to Google and we have $200,000 to work with for 28 years for the rest of our community per year. So if we're trying to start community capitalism and some bottom-up economic activity here, this is not the way to do that. Okay, and then the other thing we need to call out now is the generosity towards our school district. They're giving us $500,000 a year that increases by a little bit each year for 28 years. It ends up being about $23 million total. But importantly, they have written into the rules that if the state at any time was to repeal a special sales tax exemption that's built just for data centers, they get to stop paying the school. The exemption that they're going to get from these sales taxes, I'm estimating to be well over $100 million over the 28-year period. So they're on the hook, and they're potentially worried about changes in laws that will cost them $100 million over 28 years, and they've set up a system here where they're paying goodwill payments of $23 million to our school, and if we dare change that, they get to cut those off. So I don't really think this is goodwill as much as this is a hedge on their bet and holding our school district hostage with those payments should we start to rely on them. Okay. So who wants to come to Pine Island? They've already secured a hedge over the sales tax exemption, which a lot of states are battling over. And they've drained the entire abatement logic for this allotment for this project to potentially stifle some competitors, as well as limiting how much our town has. Their conditional use permit that approves all these special requirements that they need, including the noise, the ability to bypass the noise regulations that we all have to do to fire up their generators, is in place and signed. So to be honest, it's a little difficult from the city's perspective to know what can be done. These are legally signed documents. I don't think anybody here would want their house or their business permits revoked after the fact for something that they'd already agreed to. So where do we stand? Well, as many of you know, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy has filed a lawsuit to stop this project claiming that Ryan companies knew all along that there was a specific project and they had a specific thing in mind, and therefore, based on law, they're required to fill out an environmental impact statement that more specifically details the actual numbers, kilowatts, emissions, and what the real mitigation strategy would be, as opposed to the general AUAR. So the project is currently on hold, and the state, however, still has things that we can do. And so before I talk about those, I just want to give a quick breakdown on the history of data centers, because I think this is relevant to this conversation, and it's something I've spent a fair amount of my time actually working on in the tech industry for a while before I became a vegetable farmer. So in the early internet, we didn't have data centers. It's just a one-to-one distributed system where individuals are talking to individuals, servers communicating with a server. Now, in the middle of that, we have a routing infrastructure in the internet that allows us all to communicate with each other. But that's not really what we're talking about with data centers. Now, this one-to-one system didn't last very long because we didn't really know what to do with it. And before long, we had AOL, Yahoo, Alta Vista, Pets.com, for those of us that are old enough to remember. And these things required not just a single server. The traffic required a server room. These were people that didn't necessarily know what to do right away, and they're just stacking stuff up. Eventually, it takes entire floors. And certain companies become so big that they became very specialized in this. And if you're a small little person like me, it actually becomes a little difficult to start to do this because of the overhead and the costs and considerations of how do we maintain continuous power, how do we maintain continuous internet connection. And it actually became to the point where it's not illegal, but the BevCom and most internet providers will not give you or a typical small business, unless you pay extra money, a static IP address. Basically what that means is you've got a home, but you don't have an address and nobody can send you mail. So at your house, you could send out requests to the internet and they'll come back to you, but nobody can reliably send you one. And so if you want to have a website, or if you want to interact, you need to put your server somewhere that has those special rights. And data centers are here to serve that purpose. And indeed, they solve a lot of advantages for a number of small businesses. I bet there's a lot of businesses and government operations that are now relying on some of the things that these data centers offer. However, I want to call out something that the city says here, because part of the justification for this, and part of the whole conversation, I think, gets lost in data centers good, data centers bad. You'll hear things like, what, you're not going to use the internet anymore? And the city particularly said that this project is a data center, and data centers are needed because, quote, cloud computing and social media to banking, medical, and government operations, and quote, are all in data centers. And this is true of traditional data centers. However, note also that in a traditional data center, we're talking 70 to 80% of all the energy and all the activity and all the servers is going mostly towards YouTube and other similar video streaming platforms. This is a high intensity data thing. If we're talking just about the traditional data centers that existed a decade or two ago, we can perform all of our business needs, all of our banking needs, all of our government operations, and all of our business needs on a small fraction of what's there. But right now, we have mostly demanded video services, and the advertising revenue is there for Google to build that up. So now, what we're building is not that. We're building out what's often referred to as a hyperscale data center. These are data centers built to power artificial intelligence, both the training aspect, where they're building up a big model for themselves, and then also the inference, where you ask it a question and it spends time working through that model to provide new information. We're talking about drastically different types of systems. A traditional server rack might take no more than 10 kilowatts for a big thing. These new hyperscale ones will do 100 to 200 kilowatts in an entire rack. They are specialized hardware using specialized components, and they need a different type of architecture than a traditional data center. And so what we're seeing here are not data centers that power your everyday banking and business, and are things that I, as a small business owner, can use to help my business. These are large, massive systems, proprietary systems built exclusively to power AI. That may be important to you in this discussion, maybe not, but I think it's really important to call out that infrastructure needed to power the internet and connect us through the servers is a drop in the bucket and insignificant. The next big bucket is traditional data centers, and of that, 70% is streaming. What we need to get by in a functional life is a very small part in our modern era. hyperscale data centers are used exclusively for AI and answering those questions. I think it is McKinsey that currently estimates they're about 50% of all energy consumption. I think they're calling it to be 2/3 of all energy consumption by 2030. So again, I just want to call out, we're having this conversation, there's the core internet routing infrastructure, drop in the bucket, traditional data centers, and then we have the hyperscale, more private proprietary systems that we have today. Okay, so what can we do? So first, there's a couple things that have been done at the state level. The first one is mandating that any data center that's built has to build out an equal amount of renewable energy projects throughout the state so that the state does not fall apart behind its goal and a mandated goal that it has set for that target. However, that doesn't actually really help us at all, because if we didn't have the data center, we wouldn't need those projects. And so by adding this data center, we actually have 1,200 megawatts of wind coming online, 200 megawatts of solar, and a 300 megawatt battery plant. To put that in perspective, that solar plant will probably take about 1,000 acres of farmland to build. That's farmland that we could be using, or we could be using 4 solar plants to power our homes instead of Google. Second, the state has already required data centers to pay for their electrical infrastructure upgrades. This kind of mirrors the way states work, where they make developers pay for the initial upgrade, but then we're all collectively caught on the hook for future maintenance and upgrade costs. And I think that that's something that we could see here, where yes, they're going to come in and pay for their initial line, but if the big hyperscale data centers become a major part of our our power grid, and they start to put undue strain on it, we will have to replace things in a general way that will be difficult to say, hey, that was Google that caused that, as opposed to just general growth. And I think that we're all going to get caught on the hook. And so I would support measures that make the largest consumers of energy have higher responsibility as a percentage of their share for ongoing maintenance and construction costs, and not put that burden equally on us as residents and small businesses. All right. Okay. The other important thing here is the state has recently decided, not statutorily, but through a regulatory body, the Public Utilities Commission, that data centers may need what's called a certificate of need. So this is typically reserved for new grid-connected energy facilities. But basically what the PUC said was they denied Amazon's ability up in Becker for their ability to fast-track 250 large diesel generators. They forced them to have what's called a certificate of need, which basically says, instead of you saying we need these generators, you need to show, because there's potentially a harm to the greater society and community there, you need to show that A, you actually need those and don't just really want those, and B, if you do need those, that there is not a different method that you could use that would reduce the harm to the local communities. So I would support a measure that codifies into law that the PUC needs to have a certificate of need for hyperscale data centers for any emissions that they're creating. So we're talking about gigawatts of power here. Okay, so what else can we still do? So we could straight up ban data centers. The state bans all sorts of commercial activities, and that's something we could do. But something I'm trying to do in my politics is introduce the concept of scale. My small business is not the same as Google's corporation. And there are a lot of data centers out there, many of which are actually relatively small. Some of them might just be a single story in a warehouse built in a building in Minneapolis that you don't know exists. There are good neighbors out there, and then there are hyperscale data centers that are really trying to take advantage of the situation. So I don't believe in one-size-fits-all approaches. I generally try to apply scale, and so I don't think that's the right approach here. We could put a pause on that. A moratorium on data centers. That's happened in a number of jurisdictions, a number of cities and counties in Minnesota have done that. The state of New York has done that. I'm not opposed to that, but it is also not a final solution for us. But it could give us time to say, hey, how do we have the conversation? How do we as a society want to permit or not permit these? And if we are going to do it, how can we protect our local communities? Okay, So a quick thing we can do is redefine what light industrial means. The state says that if you are not manufacturing and you have less than 500 employees, then you are light industrial. The city leaned on that definition as part of their justification to approve original Project Skyway. This isn't going to help us, but this is a simple fix. It should be a no-brainer and would help other cities not necessarily fall into the same trap. Okay, we can reduce or end the sales tax exemption. This is a biggie, and this would make them go wild. This is the reason they are here, and this is the reason they're in a lot of places. They are shopping around for the best deals. This is not about anything other than what is the most economic way for them to do this. And so, back I think it was in 2013, we passed a special tax exemption for data centers because data centers were still new, they were still relatively small, they weren't emitting like they were before, and we were trying to grow our economy, and so this was something that was passed by the state to bring them in. And in some ways it makes sense because if you're a manufacturer in the state, you do not pay sales tax either on any equipment that you're buying that directly produces your goods. And so in a lot of ways it's analogous, but I think that this is something what we could change, and we don't necessarily do it again in a one-size-fits-all approach. I think we can apply scale so that the smaller data centers and new players to the market that want to start up and offer new services, maybe a privacy conscious service, can do so and have the same advantages that the companies got previously. But once you get to a certain level, I think we can start capping that and making the hyperscale data centers, making it less attractive for hyperscale data centers to be here in Minnesota while still protecting some of the other small players. Okay, the other thing we do is amend the state pollution law. So right now, we charge companies per tonnage of emissions. But if you have a slow trickle of emissions constantly, that might add up over a year and might cost you some money. But the case for these power plants is they don't do anything at all until they need their backup generating power, and then it rockets up high to gigawatts of power and all sorts of emissions. This, on a yearly basis, does not cost them very much money. And so I would support amending that law so for hyperscale data centers and any large emitter, that they have a different rate structure so we're not just considering the cumulative emissions, but also considering the magnitude of emissions that can be placed on a community and start redirecting those funds back to the communities that they're affecting. Okay, and then finally, we can amend the state noise laws to protect our farms and residents from what a lot of folks are seeing out there is that low frequency, constant hum vibration. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency regulates these laws, but they're written into law by legislatures, and we've chosen to use this A-weighted formula. And we basically say, hey, here are our standards during day and during night, if you're in a residence or if you're a business, or if you're a farm, and other people cannot exceed those limits. You know, now city code, of course, gives exemptions for school activities and other special events, but the general background noise should not exceed that. Data centers get to specifically get around this because of the nature of their noise. So I would support amending the laws to consider for data centers what's called C-weighted or Z-weighted measurements that would accurately capture the noise pollution coming from these data centers. And so I'll be honest, this is my favorite measure. And it kind of aligns a lot with my politics. Because I do not want to legislate what's in your bedroom. I don't want to legislate what's in your warehouse. But I darn sure do want to protect ourselves and our freedoms from harmful pollution, and both at the noise and air quality levels that greatly affect our community. And so if you can come in here and you can do this without creating pollution, without draining our water supply, without straining our grid, and without turning on your diesel generators whenever you want that are going to affect our health and well-being, I think the situation would change and we'd have a lot more sympathy for this project. And so I call for changing those laws and making them, quite frankly, invest in the measures of sound noise isolation for the equipment and any other protective measures that they need to do so that they can protect our health and well-being. All right, and finally, I'm a big believer in the U.S. Constitution and specifically the Bill of Rights, and I think we've done a very, very poor job of recognizing the spirits behind the Fourth Amendment in particular as we move to a digital age. These services, particularly hyperscale data centers, are treasure troves of your personal data. And it's only a matter of time before either a nefarious actor, a mistake, or government agencies come in and start swooping this up in mass. And I think that if we had better protections for our privacy and didn't feel like we were being taken advantage of so they can reap billions of dollars in advertising property and advertising revenue, I think that this whole project, all of them, would be much more palatable to us all. And so, with that said, thank you all very much for coming here. I appreciate you all for being here. I'm going to stick around as long as anybody wants to have any more questions or have any conversations. And we're gonna have some more food also. Before we break, does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like to say for the whole audience? Yeah, what would you like to say, honey? That's okay, I don't. Oh, thank you.
What's the Fourth Amendment?
The Fourth Amendment's going to give us protections from privacy and unlawful search and seizure. And so this is something that, just to expand on that, there's something even called the third-party doctrine you should look up. It has been protected a little bit, but basically the Supreme Court rules that if you have information and you give it to a company, a bank, Google, you no longer have Fourth Amendment protections for some of that data. And so that's something that should change. Yeah.
Will this be on your website?
It will, yes. And I got a bunch of little handouts back there. I have 4 more events coming up. We're going to be going to Plainview to talk about how to stop private fraud with public health. We're going to go to Cannon Falls and say why it's progressive to eliminate income taxes. We're going to go to Wabasha and claim that the future is agrarian. And finally, in Cannon Falls, we're going to discuss how we can end the two-party system. So I've got all that information on there with a bunch more information about my platform and what I'm doing. Thank you all.